Story 1. The man who opened a fake #1 restaurant in London using Google reviews, his back garden, and a shed that served microwave meals. Story 2. On April Fool's Day, 1974, a man burned 70 rubber tires on a dormant volcano in Alaska. He waited 3 years to hire a helicopter to carry the tires to the summit and create a picture-perfect scene. He even prompted the Coast Guard to respond. Story 3. Mozart did not like this singer, so he wrote a piece with constantly alternating high and low notes. He had noticed that when she sang low notes her chin went to her chest, and when she sang high notes her head flung back, so she appeared to bob like a chicken. Story 4. There was a Prussian whose name I cannot remember who managed to create an officer's uniform out of scraps of clothing. He used it to convince several guards on patrol to follow him into a government building, ordered the arrest of the man in charge, confiscated all the money personally, and sent the arrested man to Berlin, claiming it was by order of the king. He then ditched the uniform, took a train to Berlin, and managed to outwit the guards there. He sat back and watched the resulting confusion. The man was eventually arrested, but the public made him a celebrity and his actions were turned into a play performed all over Germany. He was not incarcerated for long, and after his release he lived comfortably for the rest of his life. Story 5. In the 1930s and 1940s, the British Broadcasting Corporation aired an April Fool's broadcast claiming that spaghetti grew on trees. They showed fake spaghetti trees, and because few people at that time knew how spaghetti was made, many believed it. Story 6. The old-fashioned New York City newspaper, The Sun, published articles in the 19th century claiming that life existed on the moon, including unicorns, winged humans, and other creatures who built temples and lived peacefully. This sparked a widespread moon craze until the reports were later exposed as fabrications. Story 7. Technically, this was not a troll since it was serving a purpose. Admiral Nelson was escaping a French fleet when a man fell overboard. Nelson's policy was to never leave anyone behind, so he turned his ship around to pick him up. The French saw his ship turn back toward them, assumed he had reinforcements beyond the horizon, and then they fled. Story 8. The mortician patented the automatic telephone switch 3 years after discovering that his rival's wife worked as a telephone operator and had been rerouting calls for his funeral parlor to her husband's. He put an entire global workforce out of work over one person's actions. Edit. Thank you for the upvotes and awards. You are awesome. Story 9. Theodore Hook was the perpetrator of the Berners Street hoax in London in 1810. He sent thousands of letters summoning vendors, tradespeople, physicians, dignitaries, and others to a resident's home, shutting down a large part of London as they descended on the same address throughout the day, while Hook and a friend watched from a house across the street, laughing loudly the whole time. Story 10. In China, there was the War of the Three Kingdoms, Wei, Shu, and Wu. Two of their armies met in battle, and the smaller force ran out of arrows. They were separated by a river. One night, the leader of the smaller force filled the fronts of their boats and rafts with straw bales and moved toward the opposing army across the river. They were immediately met with a rain of arrows. The men ducked behind the straw while the arrows stuck in it, undamaged. They then sailed back and called out, "We thank you for the arrows, we will return them shortly." This may be a tall tale from Romance of the Three Kingdoms, but it may be true. Story 11. Didn't George R. Martin once say that in the future he would love to get people so immersed in a fantasy novel that they never finish it? Story 12. Stephen Hawking was in an interview when a cord was unplugged and an alarm went off. This happened before he was completely immobile, and he slumped in his chair. The interviewers were terrified until they realized he was all right and was chuckling at his own joke. The cord and alarm were for a computer. Story 13. Eric the Red wanted people to come and live in his newfound ice-covered land, so he named it Greenland. Story 14. The motherfucker who sold the Eiffel Tower twice. Story 15. I forget his name, but a man in the 1800s bought specific tickets to a play and gave them to bald men on the street so that, when everyone took their seats, the stage lights reflecting off the bald heads spelled the word fuck when viewed from the stage. Story 16. Marcel Duchamp, among other things, submitted a urinal as an art piece to the Society of Independent Artists under a pseudonym, then served on the board that approved pieces. He also spread rumors of another work he was preparing so people would not suspect anything. I admire him. He sparked an interesting discussion in art. The urinal may actually have been submitted by a woman named Baroness Elsa von Freytag-Loringhoven, with Duchamp acting more as a curator. Story 17. Diogenes became known for his philosophical stunts, such as carrying a lamp in daylight and claiming to be looking for an honest man. He criticized Plato, disputed Plato's interpretation of Socrates, and sabotaged his lectures, sometimes distracting listeners by bringing food and eating during the discussions. Diogenes was also noted for mocking Alexander the Great publicly and directly when Alexander visited Corinth in 336 before Christ. Story 18. I posted this comment once on AskReddit about the best do-it-myself moment in history, but the tale of Agent Garbo, the double agent whose real name was Juan Pujol Garcia, applies here. He deceived Hitler and the Nazi regime so thoroughly it boggles the mind, and he did not merely get away with it. He was awarded an Iron Cross by them. Juan Pujol Garcia was a hotel clerk and a former unsuccessful chicken farmer who was frustrated with the fascist government of Spain. Germany's warmongering was becoming frightening. France had fallen, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and the United States of America were still neutral at that point, and only Britain remained to stand against the Nazis. He later said he believed he had to do something for the good of humanity. By all accounts, he was a nobody, a hotel clerk and failed chicken farmer who had briefly served on both sides in the Spanish Civil War, leaving him opposed to both fascism and communism. So Juan decided to become a spy and undermine Hitler. The British, whom he wanted to help, were not initially interested. He had asked to help at the embassy in Madrid several times, but they declined. Undeterred, he decided it would be easier to work from within. He reinvented himself as an enthusiastic supporter of the fascist government and volunteered to help the Germans spy on Britain, claiming he had a way to get undercover there. This was all false. The Germans accepted him. Unable to get to Britain, he went to Lisbon, Portugal, where he studied Britain at the library so he could convincingly invent reports. He sent the German Navy on a wild goose chase for a non-existent naval convoy near the Mediterranean island of Malta. The Germans became convinced he was their best source in Britain. Most other German agents were being captured. Garcia's supposed recruits were either invented or fabricated and served as plausible fall guys when his intelligence was inaccurate. The British, meanwhile, were looking for this source since broken German codes suggested there was an agent setting up a spy ring in Britain. When they examined the intercepted messages, one detail stood out. Juan claimed to have a Scottish contact who would do anything for a liter of wine. The use of the metric term tipped the British off that the messages were fabricated. The Lisbon British Embassy passed the information to Military Intelligence, Section 6. They brought him to Britain and gave him the codename Agent Garbo. Working with Military Intelligence, Section 6, he continued to feed the Germans a mix of pure lies, true but useless information, and useful intelligence that arrived too late to help German operations. Most importantly, he convinced the Germans that the Normandy invasion would be a feint and that the main Allied invasion would occur much farther east at Calais. He told them the 1st United States Army Group, commanded by General Patton, would lead the main assault. The 1st United States Army Group did not exist. It was a phantom formation composed of non-existent divisions, stationed in a fake base filled with inflatable tanks and aircraft to deceive German reconnaissance over Dover. Convinced by these deceptions, the Germans kept large numbers of troops and armored divisions at Calais to repel an invasion that never came. Those forces could have been used to counter the Allied landings at Normandy, but instead they remained idle at Calais. For his work deceiving the Germans, they awarded Pujol the Iron Cross, 2nd class. The British government later made him a member of the Order of the British Empire. After the war, his German handler presented him with the Iron Cross in person and apologized profusely for failing to win the war he had helped them fight. In summary, a failed chicken farmer from Spain waged a personal campaign of deception against Nazi Germany and succeeded. Story 19. A Chinese general, whose city was besieged by a much larger army, opened the main gate and sat atop it, playing his flute. The enemy thought it was a trap, so they packed their belongings and left. Story 20. Giles Corey was a farmer caught up in the Salem witch trials. He was sentenced to pressing, being slowly crushed by stones, to force him to enter a plea. Each time he was questioned, he simply said more weight. He died without making a plea. Story 21. A person somehow got a network news program to say that a crashed plane was piloted by 4 men named Hu Li Fuck, Some Ting Wong, Wee Tu Lo, and Bang Ding Ao. Story 22. Basil Zaharoff. A Greek arms dealer, he donated a submarine to the Greek government. He then told the Turks that the Greeks had a submarine and sold the Turks 2. He told the Russians that the Turks had 2 submarines and sold the Russians 2 as well. None of the submarines worked. The first submarine was donated to the Greeks, not sold. Story 23. The person who placed an ice troll 3/4 of the way up the path to High Hrothgar. Story 24. On May 3, 1978, Gary Thurk sent the first spam email on the Advanced Research Projects Agency network, marketing the Digital Equipment Corporation System 20 family of office computers. He succeeded in annoying many people, and the governing authorities started a crackdown, stating, "Nobody should be allowed to send a message with a header that long, no matter what it is about." Thurk did not know it at the time, but he created a new type of email. Story 25. Theodore Roosevelt. He was shot, gave a 1-hour speech mocking his assassin, and then went to the hospital. Story 26. Michelangelo, without a doubt, was commissioned to paint a chapel and included more penises and buttocks on it than you have ever seen. Story 27. The Russians repeatedly retreated when Napoleon attacked, forcing him to abandon the campaign because his army suffered from disease and other hardships. Story 28. Orson Welles performed a radio play that told listeners the Martians were invading. The next day he claimed the broadcast had frightened millions of people, though in reality it was only a few dozen. Story 29. France built a fake Paris during World War I to confuse German bomber pilots. Story 30. I do not know if this has been said, but Stalin is said to have convicted his closest friends of treason and had them sentenced to death. Later, they were blindfolded and awaiting the firing squad. The squad fired blanks. Stalin pulled the blindfolds off and said, "Gotcha. Legend." Story 31. Titan Leeds' father, Daniel Leeds, was a devout Quaker who fell out with the local Quaker community when he began publishing an almanac in 1687. Daniel Leeds turned over publication to his son, Titan Leeds, in 1716. The American Almanac predated Franklin's Almanac. Franklin used the first edition of his almanac to promote a hoax predicting Leeds's death on October 17, 1733, at 3:29 in the afternoon, at the moment of the conjunction of the Sun and Mercury. He encouraged readers to buy the next year's edition of Poor Richard's Almanac to see if he was right, as a publicity stunt and an attempt to drive Titan Leeds' American Almanac out of business. When the predicted date passed, Franklin published Leeds' obituary anyway. When challenged by the very much alive Leeds, Franklin insisted Leeds had in fact died and was being impersonated by an inferior publisher. When Leeds actually died in 1738, Franklin publicly commended the impostors for ending their charade. Story 32. George Psalmanazar was a blonde-haired, blue-eyed Frenchman who pretended to be a royal from the island of Formosa, now known as Taiwan. He invented a fake religion, diet, and language, including fabricated syntax, which he taught at universities across Europe. This occurred in the 17th century. Story 33. Sergei Korolev became frustrated with the Soviet government because it was not interested in funding his space exploration projects. He had his propaganda team publish articles suggesting the Soviet Union was close to sending something into space. The United States took the bait and began working on its satellite program. When the Soviet government saw the United States doing that, it panicked and funded Korolev's projects. Korolev and his team outmaneuvered them. Story 34. The employee at Four Seasons Landscaping who took the reservation for the Trump campaign did so without asking questions. They clearly knew it was a mistake. Their company is not a well-known venue for presidential speeches. Story 35. That fucking toad from the original Mario game kept telling me Princess Peach is in a different castle. Story 36. Malleable Duck rickrolled Rick Astley on Reddit. Story 37. Herostratus. He burned the temple of Artemis around 400 BCE, apparently just for notoriety. He was executed for it, painfully, and a law was enacted forbidding his name from ever being mentioned. Yet here we are more than 2,000 years later, and Herostratus and his deed are not forgotten. Story 38. I am convinced that James Joyce wrote Finnegan's Wake to troll literary scholars who look for deeper meaning in a giant heap of nonsense. Story 39. Sylvia Knight performed for Iceland in the Eurovision Song Contest 2006. I believe no one outside Iceland knew what was going on or why she acted that way. She behaved rudely during interviews, and then there was her ridiculous song and stage presence. Sylvia Knight was an over-the-top character from a fictional Icelandic reality television show. So iconic. Story 40. Steve Wilhite. He invented the graphics interchange format and later won a Webby Award for it. Webby Award acceptance speeches are limited to 5 words. He went up and said it is pronounced GIF, not graphics interchange format. Even God himself could come down and tell me otherwise. I would not believe it. It is graphics interchange format. Story 41. Caligula. Much of what seems crazy about him stemmed from his provocation of the Senate, which then dragged his legacy through the mud. He was one of the few emperors to invest in Roman infrastructure with Roman funds. In other words, he taxed the senatorial class to rebuild public waterways. As emperor, he maintained a mutually contemptuous relationship with the Senate. He knew how much power he had and was paranoid enough to avoid being killed for wielding it. Historians are still untangling how much was deliberate trolling by Caligula and how much was later recontextualized as a smear campaign. Story 42. Kim Tae-yum was an ancient historic Korean conman who appears only in Japanese history books, as he was not important in Korean records. Almost a century after Korean unification under Silla, Japan and Silla had strained relations because Silla destroyed Japan's ally Beech. In March 752, it is recorded that Kim and an entourage of 300 people arrived in Kyushu claiming he was a prince. 3 months later, he had an audience with the empress in Nara, claiming Silla wanted to forge a relationship with Japan and that he had brought gifts for the empress and the court. He compared the empress's status to that of the Tang emperor and did much flattery to please the Japanese court. He claimed to be a royal servant of Silla, and according to custom the empress had to pay for their lodgings. But he did not present an emissary letter bearing Silla's seal. The Japanese grew suspicious, but after he assured them he would show the official seal the following year, Kim left Japan in July. Believing Kim's false promises, the empress sent emissaries in February 753, who were denied access to the palace. Many historians argue that the Korean monarch at the time was in his early 30s, making it unlikely he had an adult son. Enraged at the amount of money spent on the conman and at being duped, the Japanese removed the empress from the throne and planned an invasion of Korea in 762. I am not sure if this man appears on the English Wikipedia, but searching his name yields many Japanese and Korean primary sources. Story 43. Leonardo da Vinci made almost no actual contributions to science. Much of what he documented in his journals could not be read because he wrote in mirror script, and many of his discoveries were rediscovered by the time his notebooks were decoded. Story 44. Whoever has been posting the QAnon drops for the past 4 years. Story 45. Whoever devised the United States Armed Forces plan during the Cold War to drop boxes of extra-large condoms labeled as medium to Soviet troops caused a misunderstanding. The Soviets thought the Americans were well endowed. It was arguably the greatest military troll of all time. Story 46. Pope John XII became pope while still in his teens and served into his late 20s. He indulged in wine and sexual debauchery and showed extreme indifference to his responsibilities. He ruled the Papal States until his death. John XII is widely regarded as one of the worst popes of the century and as an example of how wealth and powerful connections influenced the papacy. Story 47. When God told 100-year-old Abraham to kill his only son, and then said, laughing out loud, just kidding, right before Abraham actually did it. Story 48. Heinrich Schliemann, often called the father of modern archaeology, was criticized as a fraud and con artist. He sought the historical Troy and, when led to the alleged site, used explosives to destroy parts he deemed insufficiently ancient, discarded many finds, misidentified the wrong occupational layer as the real Troy, and took credit for the discovery. Story 49. During basic training in 1914, a British soldier was a terrible shot on the rifle range. He could not hit the broadside of a barn. Eventually, his instructor snapped and shouted, "For God's sake, go behind that shed and shoot yourself." The soldier immediately took his rifle and walked behind the shed. About 30 seconds later, the rest of the men heard a single rifle shot. "Bloody hell, he's done it," said the instructor. Another 30 seconds passed, and the soldier reappeared from behind the shed. He told the instructor, "I tried to shoot myself, Sergeant, but I missed again." Story 50. Andy Kaufman certainly deserves recognition. If you have never seen the videos of him becoming a semi-professional wrestler to taunt Southerners, watch them. Story 51. The person behind the Max Headroom incident remains unknown 33 years later. Story 52. Timothy Dexter was an idiot, but somehow he got rich by selling bed warmers to the Caribbean. Story 53. Rasputin, the man who seduced the Tsarina, was given enough cyanide to kill an elephant and was shot many times, yet he died from drowning. In Soviet Russia, you kill cyanide. Story 54. D. B. Cooper. This man was audacious. On November 24, 1971, he hijacked a Boeing 727 by showing a briefcase that appeared to contain dynamite. He also took a hostage and demanded $200,000 in unmarked bills, plus 2 primary parachutes and 2 backup parachutes. Believing he intended to keep the hostage and use 1 parachute for the hostage, the authorities did not sabotage either parachute. After receiving the cash and parachutes, he demanded to be flown to Mexico. Once airborne, he insisted on being left alone in the passenger section. He then used a little-known feature of the 727, a rear stairway that opens to the outside, and parachuted out of the plane in the middle of the night somewhere in the forests north of Vancouver, Washington. He was never found. In 2016, a full 45 years later, the Federal Bureau of Investigation closed the case, concluding he was likely deceased or close to 90. In February 1980, a young boy found some bills whose serial numbers matched those given to Cooper. They were buried along the Columbia River, not far from where Cooper is thought to have landed. The roll of bills was wrapped with a rubber band in nearly perfect condition, although studies indicated that that type of rubber band would deteriorate within less than 2 years. Therefore, either someone intentionally buried the money, or the boy discovered it and later fabricated the story. Why would Cooper bury some of the money? Did he survive? I do not know. If the bomb was fake and he did not keep all the money, he clearly pulled off an audacious stunt. Story 55. Basil Zaharoff was an arms dealer who managed to sell 5 submarines to 3 different countries. None of the submarines worked. Story 56. Charles Vance Miller was a Canadian. He left real and fake money on sidewalks in poor neighborhoods to watch who would be stressed about picking it up. He even trolled people after he died. He left a property in Jamaica to 3 men who hated each other, prevented them from selling it, and stipulated that after the last died, the proceeds should go to the poor of Kingston, Jamaica. He left shares in O'Keefe's Brewing Company Limited of Toronto to Protestant ministers and every member of the Orange Order in Ontario. The brewery was Catholic-owned and disliked by many Protestants, who were campaigning at the time to ban alcohol. He willed his racetrack to his competitor and to the leading organization campaigning against gambling. He promised about $500,000 in 1936, about $10 million in today's money, to the woman who had the most babies in the 10 years after his death. During the Depression, very poor women competed for the prize. There are reports that some husbands raped their wives to keep them pregnant. Estate administrators and courts resisted awarding the prize to Italian and other immigrant families, and much of the money ultimately went to upper-middle-class Protestants from long-established families. Summary: Miller used his will to create spiteful, provocative legacies that caused social harm, financial losses for competitors, and intensified sectarian tensions, apparently intended as a posthumous joke. Story 57. Juan Putil Garcia was a man in World War II who decided to act as a counterintelligence agent against the Nazis. Britain and the United States rejected his offer, so he acted independently. He created an alias as a pro-Nazi Spanish nationalist, invented many fictitious agents, and supplied the Germans with false reports for payment. He caused German forces to divert resources searching for non-existent convoys and ships for years, and ultimately deceived German intelligence so effectively that he was recruited by Allied intelligence services. Story 58. J.D. McMahon reportedly sold investors on blueprints for a 480-inch tall tower in Wichita Falls, Texas, in 1919. The trick was that the investors assumed it was a 480-foot tall tower, a building 12 times larger, and invested accordingly. He never lied to the investors. He never verbally claimed the tower would be nearly 500 feet tall, and the blueprints clearly showed the inch mark on every measurement, not the foot mark. He never corrected their misconception and left Texas with the remaining money after his contractual obligation to build the tower was complete. Story 59. The man who created a machine that induced rain in California and secured government funding. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.